Why do we believe the Bible? Because of evidence, lots and lots of it. We're going to take a brief look at just one piece in particular, the prophecy that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 24. It is, to the casual observer, interesting or confusing, but if you're a fan of history, it is shocking, it is unreasonable, it is creepy how accurate it is. The events that would have had to happen are so unlikely that it's really hard to overstate. Here's the story. First, what did Jesus predict? In verse 2, that the temple would be destroyed, and not only that, but so thoroughly that not one stone would be left on top of one another. And in verse 34, that it would happen in their lifetime. There are a lot more details between those two verses that make it even more interesting, but just sticking with those two bare minimum facts, what can we learn? We know from history that this did take place in AD 70, about 38 years after Jesus said those words. But why was it so unlikely? A skeptic might say, surely it couldn't have been that difficult to predict. The Jews and Romans were always at each other's throats. Eventually something bad had to go down, right? It's true that they didn't get along well on occasion, but before the Great Jewish Revolt around 66 AD, it was a pretty amicable working relationship. Here's the backstory. The Roman Empire was famous for being relatively hands-off, understanding, non-divisive, and even passive, according to scholars. Romans don't go around looking for trouble. In general, they had good relationships with the Jews. This relationship was so good with Rome that 1 in 20 people in the city of Rome were Jews around the time of Christ's birth. Many kind concessions by the Romans were made toward the Jews to keep the peace. Jews were exempted from taxation every 7 years, and allowed to rest on the Sabbath each week as well. They were granted special exemption from pagan rituals, and Rome even minted special coins free of images to comply with Jewish scruples, despite the fact that elsewhere the coins bore images. Jews were not required to recognize the divinity of the emperor as all other people in the empire had to do. They merely had to offer prayers for the emperor's well-being. Jews were free to practice their religion, enjoy their holidays, and follow customs as they wished, as long as they didn't rock the boat. Rome didn't care. So while Judea at the time of Christ was no daycare, it was hardly the war zone that some portray it as. Riots would happen, Rome would put it down, and things would go back to normal. For instance, in 6 AD, Judas of Galilee led a revolt, but it was quickly put down and things went back to normal. In about 40 AD, Caligula tried to have his statue set up in the Temple of Jerusalem. Riots followed. He backed down and things pretty much returned back to normal. Things were relatively peaceful up until the mid-60s AD. And it would take a multitude of simultaneous accidents, incredible bad luck, and remote coincidences for Jesus' comically unlikely prophecy to actually take place in the time frame that he said. What exactly happened? You've probably heard of the main two Jewish sects in the first century, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. While they didn't like the Romans, they were more or less fine getting along with them. During the time of Christ, there was one more group, the Zealots. They were less amenable to working with the Romans, but during the early 1st century, their activity was largely that of non-compliance, rather than outright violence and rebellion. A couple decades after Christ died, around 54 AD, a more extreme splinter group from the Zealots formed, the Sicarii, or daggermen. Their policy was to kill Romans and kill anyone else who doesn't also want to kill Romans. It was these people who helped instigate the downward spiral in relations with Rome. This extremist group were more and more attacking Roman citizens, and around the same time, a new hard-line Roman procurator, Gessius Florus, was appointed in 64 AD. He escalated the situation by plundering the temple in Jerusalem and executing up to 6,000 Jews, triggering another revolt. General Cestius Gallus, with an overwhelming force of 30,000 men, marched to Jerusalem to put down the revolt before they could really fortify the city. But he was ambushed, and crucially, he lost his siege equipment. This would make putting down the revolt in Jerusalem take much longer. A huge concern because he arrived just before the October rainy season came. He feared that his supply lines would be cut off, so he decided to instead fall back. giving the Jews even more time to fortify the city and make preparation for war. As General Cestius Gallus retreats, he's caught in another ambush and shockingly takes tremendous losses. Thousands of troops are killed, one of the most humiliating defeats the Romans have ever sustained in their entire history. In a situation like this, typically a tiny nation like Israel would negotiate some concessions from the much more powerful Rome. Rome would also get concessions from the Jews and they would agree to peace. Nobody wanted it to escalate. Nobody except for the extremists, that is. Believing God was on their side, this win emboldened the Sicarii to push for complete victory and all-out open war. Emperor Nero appoints Vespasian as general to take over and crush the rebellion, bringing to bear more than double the number of troops as before. He began quickly reconquering Judean cities and land around Jerusalem, but the city itself wasn't attacked just yet. Before Vespasian could lean hard on Jerusalem, shocking news comes. The Emperor Nero is dead. Roman law required that all Roman commanders had to wait to be reappointed and receive orders from the new emperor before they could take any further action, giving the Jews even more time to fortify. To think that Jerusalem could have been successfully sieged at this point was nearly unthinkable. It was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. It had not one, not two, but 3 sets of walls, 164 towers, enough food and water reserves to last literally for years, and at the time of the revolt, the temple was transformed into a nearly impregnable fortress, which was sworn to be defended to the death. At any normal time, rulers are reluctant to commit troops to a siege because sieges are notorious for being extremely costly and protracted. But this is no normal time. It's at this point that Rome goes into freefall politically. This is the infamous Year of the 4 Emperors. After Nero's death, Galba takes over and is quickly assassinated, followed by Otho, who is quickly usurped by Vitellius, who himself is also killed. Then General Vespasian becomes Emperor Vespasian. Never in Roman history has there been so much political unrest. Vespasian is emperor, but his hold on power is weak. He needs to establish his authority and popularity quickly, and he knows that the best way to do this is to achieve a spectacular military victory. Luckily, Vespasian has a son who happens to also be a very talented general, Titus. He sends his son to launch the attack. Any glory that he wins will reflect on his father, the emperor. It's now the spring of AD 70. Jerusalem is once again fully under siege. On several occasions, Titus offers peace terms, but they always refused. It seemed that they were at a stalemate. Jesus' prophecy about the temple was bound to fail. He was nearly out of time for it to happen in that generation. The Jews have fortified Jerusalem beyond what it already had been and stockpiled enough food and water to last for years. Nobody realistically expected the Romans to succeed. Titus had no way to feed his large army for long enough to outlast Jerusalem. But the extremists foolishly choose to burn the food supply that could have fed the city for years in order to spur the inhabitants to fight. Now there was no other option. In the end, Titus encircles the defenders with a wall nearly 5 miles in circumference, all around the city, and starves them out. And eventually, 2 of the 3 sets of the city walls are broken through. Josephus tells us that before Titus makes his final assault, he debates about what to do with the temple. Should it be destroyed or left standing? What do you think he decided? Titus decides to save the temple. It was not to be destroyed. Jesus' prophecy is once again bound to fail. When the Roman soldiers break in, though, chaos ensues, and tragically, a soldier takes a firebrand and tosses it into the temple against orders, causing the building to catch fire. Titus orders the fire to be extinguished, but no one obeys him. The temple burns to the ground. But Jesus didn't predict that the temple would be burned. He specifically said not one stone would be left on top of another. Well, the siege isn't over yet. Remember, there were 3 sets of walls and defenders in the upper city still. It is only at this point that they have the nerve to try and negotiate with the Romans. This sends Titus into a rage. He's offered them peace terms over and over again, and they refused. Josephus records Titus's response. "You have been incited against the Romans by Roman kindness. We gave you this land with your own kings to rule over you. We maintained your ancestral laws, and we permitted you to live as you wished. Most important of all, we allowed you to exact tribute and collect offerings for your God, and now, like untamed reptiles, you spit your venom on those who have nourished you." This was the Roman attitude toward Jews. They for so long were not seen as enemies. Rome seemed to bend over backwards to accommodate them. But the defenders continued to act as if they had some sort of leverage. If they merely acknowledged that there was nothing left to fight for, Jerusalem may have been spared. So Titus, who was previously so inclined to be lenient, now gives the order to raze the entire city to the ground. All that remains today of the once spectacular temple is the great platform upon which it once stood, called the Temple Mount. Jews to this day lament the destruction of their temple. This and much more, there are a lot more details that we haven't even mentioned, Jesus predicted decades beforehand. Again, the unlikeliness of which can hardly be overstated. If any one of the unlikely things happened any differently, the temple very well could have still been standing to this day. There are many, many more details that we could go over as to why this was such a very incredibly shocking thing, what Jesus predicted, and how extremely remote the odds of those things happening were. That is, unless Jesus was who he said he was, and he wasn't merely guessing. Of course, that just so happens to be the case. Since Jesus is God, since he is omniscient, he knew with certainty what was going to happen, and he predicted it in detail. That is the God that we serve. When he says something, he means it. That same God says that he loves you, and he means that. And he wants you to be saved. But he also says that if you are not baptized into his body, the church, having believed, repented, and confessed him as Christ, if you do not do that, you cannot be saved. You will die in your sins. Do you want to learn more about this God? Do you want to discover more evidence of him? If you have any questions, even hard questions, we would love to help you. Please reach out to us at the Gospel Broadcasting Network. Thanks for watching.